In incredibly unprecedented fashion, another hurricane is developing in the Gulf and is expected to make landfall in Florida this week. This may be the second major hurricane to make landfall in the state in as little as 2 weeks, with significant impacts across the state, especially at the coastline where catastrophic damage is possible. We typically see less than one major hurricane landfall per year in the United States as a whole. This, as mentioned before, could be the second in as little as 2 weeks, an unprecedented number and what we're focusing on in our forecast ahead. We start here with the National Hurricane Center, and what you can see right now is a very active Atlantic with Hurricanes Kirk and Leslie, which will stay away from land. But, of course, we have Milton, currently a tropical storm, but expected to rapidly strengthen. And here's your latest forecast cone as of late Saturday night. You can see this storm goes from tropical storm to hurricane as soon as Monday morning here per the latest National Hurricane Center forecast. And as early as the afternoon on Tuesday, it's expected to reach major hurricane status, Category 3 or stronger. Landfall is going to be on the Florida Gulf coastline, likely as a major hurricane or very close, late Wednesday, sometime in the afternoon or evening. The later this storm makes landfall, the more time it has to strengthen. That's certainly a concern here. One of the other things worth mentioning is that the land area that may be impacted per our latest forecast spans almost the entire Florida Gulf coastline here. It's a very wide cone because there is still quite a range of uncertainty. And with that, if you're anywhere from near the coastline, near Tallahassee, similar to where Helene made landfall, as far south as Naples, Florida, even a little bit farther south of that, you really need to be on high alert here as the impacts will be life-threatening. With the storm surge and the wind, of course, we're talking about significant impacts. And, of course, with precursor rainfall, flooding is going to be a certain fate for many places in Florida. Now, we can also take a look at some of those spaghetti plots, as we call them. And these are our hurricane models and global models, generally speaking. And what you're seeing here is a range of outcomes on some of these models. Now, what you're taking a look at basically is much of that same area of coastline under the gun for the greatest risk of landfall. These are positioned sort of in the middle of that cone you saw. Of course, with the forecast that will evolve over time, it is fair to have that extra wiggle room a little bit farther north and south, again, which is why the cone is a little bit wider than what you're seeing here. But we do have a reasonable, consistent, and well agreed upon track here, and that would be landfall in Florida as we get into the later portion of Wednesday. And the question marks about whether it'll make landfall or not, honestly, sad to say, but are pretty small. This one does seem like it will be a storm that makes landfall and may be quite impactful too. We can take a look at some of those same models to get an idea of intensity of this storm. And what you're seeing here is still a lot of uncertainty, but a broad consensus that this thing is going to end up somewhere in the Category 3 or Category 2 range. Now, there is some wiggle room. Sure, there is the potential this ends up moving a little bit quicker, having a little bit of a harder time with some dry air out there, and perhaps it does stay a strong Category 1. I would be surprised. This looks like a Category 3 type of hurricane to me, but that is a best case scenario. Worst case scenario, we do have the potential still for this to reach lower end Category 4 strength. And certainly that is something that we need to take seriously, as that would still create even more significant impacts upon landfall. But what does appear most likely, based on what we're seeing here, you can see that sort of area of agreement in the Category 2 to Category 3 range. Based on the conditions in the Gulf, this storm looking to be a bit more compact, and, everything coming together, it does look like we have plenty of room to run for this. And certainly if we do see that strengthening a bit quicker, you can see that would likely take it to that Category 3 strength before it makes landfall. So I do personally expect a major hurricane, but again, we will hope for the best, and there is still some wiggle room on both ends there. So certainly a very impactful storm we need to watch out for, but the rain itself is going to begin before the hurricane even reaches land, and we're going to talk about who's going to see the heaviest rain. I'll also give you a look at some of the factors that will steer this storm north and south, and we'll also take a peek here at whether this has a chance to move up the East Coast after it makes landfall in Florida. We're starting here with our American Ensemble members, and what we're going to take a look at are some of those steering factors like I mentioned. Now, you're going to notice Helene right out here in the Gulf. It's going to pop up on your screen in just a moment as we move this forward. This is really early on Monday, but as we get into Tuesday, there it is. Those members really picking out the core of that low. Now, what is keeping this storm from traveling farther north is actually this area of high pressure out here, and with it, there is a cold front. You can't actually see it on this map, but it basically is the leading edge of that cooler air mass, that high pressure system. That cold front is moving south, and with it, it's going to keep this storm from hitting any other portions of the Gulf. If that cold front advances faster, it's going to force the storm farther south. So that's an important piece of the forecast to look at. Details still a bit uncertain here. But there's the storm. You can clearly see it reaching Florida. I'm going to move this forward. You're going to see it making landfall in Florida here. Now, what we see is a bit of a spread in some of our members. I want to let you know that I do believe this storm is going to be moving farther east here. But you can see the range of outcomes really anywhere in this circle. That's where this storm, Milton, could be. Even some slower members, some stragglers still hanging out in Florida. But the take-home message here, the key thing, is that we see this high-pressure system take over across much of the East Coast. And I'm outlining some of our isobars there. What this is going to do is it's going to keep this storm from riding up the East Coast. So with the forecast, you see that the storm, it does cross Florida. It may be a hurricane in the Atlantic again, but this system is going to keep that storm moving eastwards, and it will not let it break up the East Coast. So we don't have to worry so much. Unless you're on the Georgia or South Carolina coastline, the storm could meander off the coastline there, but it does seem very unlikely this makes a second landfall. It is likely to be pushed out thanks to that high pressure system. So that's a big piece of the forecast there. I also want to get into that rainfall, like I said. So we're going to take a closer look at the southeast now. And I also want to talk about, again, the precursor rain that is going to be a problem here. So let me navigate to the European model, and I'm going to show you what we're seeing on the latest, which essentially is going to take us to the threat for flooding beginning as early as Monday or Tuesday. And what you're seeing right here is that rain already over Florida here. This is actually late Sunday. We'll move it forward. Here's Monday and even Tuesday. The storm isn't even close to land yet, and you see a good rainfall leading up. Now, we do have a bit of a break before that storm comes in. That's the sinking air. Because the hurricane is nearby, you usually have sinking air around it. That's the calm before the storm. And then, of course, as the storm gets in here, you have a resurgence of rainfall, and it could be quite a bit of rain, especially if you're on the northern side of this storm here, which is where we may see some of the heaviest rainfall. If you're just north of that center of the low 2, that is, depending on exactly the geography, where the storm makes landfall, that is where the strongest surge could be in some of the most life-threatening conditions. So what I'm seeing here, this is just one run, by the way. We're not going to take this verbatim, but regardless, if you're anywhere where I just drew that black line, that's where you may have that life-threatening storm surge. In fact, it seems pretty likely to be somewhere along the coastline there, and I do expect we're going to see mandatory evacuations for those areas as a result. I want to show you the total rainfall, by the way, here too. So even these inland areas, we're talking about impacts due to rain. We're going to add up the rain basically from this point forwards, and anywhere you're seeing red coloration, that's over 2 inches. Anywhere you're seeing gold coloration, that's over 4. Here we are on Tuesday. Storm hasn't even made landfall yet. You're seeing that potential for flooding rains, especially in the central part of the state, parts of southern Florida. And then here we are after the storm moves through, and you can see that swath of very heavy rain. Those gold colors indicating locations that may see as much as a foot of rain, in fact. But really, anywhere you're seeing those colors, we're looking at a good 6 to 12 inches. Now, the exact position of this heaviest rainfall, there is some leeway for it to be a little bit farther north. There is certain leeway for it to be a bit farther south. But one thing that's for sure, you're seeing the entire state of Florida that is going to pick up at least 3 inches of rainfall. And the most we are looking at would be up to a foot. And that does seem realistic for some spots. So certainly flooding a concern in these inland areas too. And again, if we do have a major hurricane make landfall, we're talking about wind speed that is going to be on the order, sustained winds of about 115, 120 miles per hour, could even be more depending on how strong the storm gets. And of course, that's going to cause significant damage to the coastline. And even through central Florida, even the eastern coastline of Florida will see wind damage. I do expect power outages, so it'll be very important that residents charge their phones and make preparations now, buy bottled water, and just really you have to make sure you have a hurricane plan, because we know this is going to make landfall in Florida, and it's best to plan ahead now, whether that means hunkering down at home and making sure you have the supplies you need or evacuating. We will have to watch as we gain more certainty in this forecast, but certainly one that is very dire and needs to be taken very seriously too. Okay, to a lighter note, and we're going to go over this part a little quicker, but what we're looking at is the rest of the country this week, because there is some changes in the weather that will be impactful across the rest of the country too. Perhaps not as much as a hurricane, but stuff we want to cover. So let's jump into the forecast, and we're going to look at the Northeast and the West especially. And you're already seeing this show up here as early as Monday. Those orange colors, that indicates a strong ridge in the west where summer is going to do its best to hang on. Meanwhile, we're going to watch this trough out here, especially in the northeast, where many areas will see their first frost and lows in the 20s and 30s, in fact. So a cooler week ahead for some spots, summer for others. So let's put this into motion. And here we are, we're looking at Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So by the middle of the week here, you can see that ridge is still hanging on very strong across the western portion of the United States, beginning to shift a little bit farther into the plains though. Again, that's where summer is going to try to hold on, especially a little bit farther north. Meanwhile, this trough and really becoming more of a cutoff low becomes quite pronounced in the northeast. And this is by the middle of the week where we're going to see our first frost show up for portions of the northeast. Many areas basically away from the coastline, so in the interior, will see their first frost this week. We'll push this forward more. You're looking at Thursday now, Friday, and we begin to see that trough pull away. Still will be a little bit below average in the northeast, but temperatures bounce back a little closer to normal. In the central part of the U.S., that's where we're going to see this ridge migrate to. So if you're looking for a more summer-like weekend and you live in the middle of the United States, you may get it. Closer to the west coast, that's where we have a new trough coming in. So the Pacific Northwest is expected to cool off a bit as we head into the weekend again, but certainly it's not going to be much because this ridge builds right back in that area. And actually, as we take a look a little farther out into next week, wouldn't shock me if we continue to see summer really try to hold on farther west, and especially in those more northern areas. So we'll take a quick look at where those temperature anomalies will be greatest, and we'll also take a peek at our fall foliage and how that may evolve this week too. As promised, here are those temperature anomalies. Here on Monday, we see those blue colors indicating cooler than average temperatures for much of the east, especially in the northeast, and for a lot of the west. Even in California, we're looking at temperatures as much as 20 degrees above average. We're talking about 90s in some of those spots, and even into the north central U.S., we're talking about 80s where you're seeing those orange colors. As we move into Tuesday here, temperature anomalies still, we're learning about 5 degrees below average out east, and out west, we're talking about temperatures that are around 15 degrees above average, as high as 20 above average if you're on the high terrain out there in the plains. Now moving us into Wednesday, still warm in the west. Certainly we'll be talking about the potential for a record high to pop up out here somewhere where you have those most significant anomalies. Meanwhile, you can see how much cooler it is a bit farther east. We'll keep pushing this forward. Here we are Thursday. Still warm out there in the central part of the country. Still a chance for some records in the Dakotas, even up to Minnesota. You can see much cooler down towards the southeast coastline. That's due to the rainfall from what is going to be Milton. Friday, still warm in the central U.S. Saturday, warm in the central U.S. We're seeing some recovery in the northeast. And here we are on Sunday. Generally a warmer than average start to October for most of the country, but it'll take longer for that warmth to reach those areas farther east. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to take a look at our fall foliage and what's ahead this week. As always, here's our look at fall foliage this week, one of my favorite parts of our forecast. And what you're seeing, all those brown colors, are mountainous areas actually beyond their peaks, especially out by the Rockies. You're seeing a good swath of that in the highest terrain. But the good news is that means off the highest terrain, we're seeing foliage reach its peak. Same thing out here in the Northeast. We're seeing past peak foliage in the highest terrain, but you can be in some of the flatter areas, even in the northern Midwest, where we're seeing this foliage really peak. And this is big because not many people live in mountains, but where people actually live, on lake shores, like we're seeing around the Great Lakes, places like Denver, Colorado, farther south in New England, that's where we're actually going to get to enjoy more of these colors, more accessible for people. I'm going to move this forward through the week so you can see everything that's ahead here. And what we're seeing by the end of the week is fall foliage really peaking now across the northern U.S. Doesn't really matter where you are, it will be nearing or reaching its peak. So this is going to be a big one for leaves changing colors. Get those cameras ready, maybe plan some trips, especially if you're in the northern U.S. I mean, it looks great for getting outside, seeing some of that fall foliage. And we'll move it ahead one more week to the middle to later days of October. And the reason you really want to get out this week is because you can see across the northern U.S. that window's small. We will be past our peak in about 2 weeks in many of those spots. So certainly we continue to see that color dive farther south, reaching some cities like Des Moines, Chicago, even down closer to Boston, and out towards Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. But if you're in the northern U.S. or you're in those mountains, get out and see it sooner than later, because we know it's not going to last for that long. And certainly, again, the fall only comes once a year, so you want to take advantage of it while you have it. All right, with that, we're going to wrap up the forecast. And again, I cannot stress enough how serious the storm is going to be in Florida. I'll tell you, just given we already have a lot of recovery efforts going to areas impacted by Helene, this has some extra level of concern. I'll say from a meteorological standpoint, I don't really remember seeing such a quick back-to-back hit like this. So really, we're going to be pushing our resources to the limit, and you really need to do what you can to take care of yourself and your neighbors and be smart about those decisions. If you have to evacuate, don't think twice about it, and make sure you have those things like you're charging your devices, you have some fresh water, you have some food, you're ready to be without power or even communication for a couple days in a worst case scenario if you're in Florida. So certainly we are going to be hoping for the best case scenario down there, but there is a lot of concern, of course, with everything that lies ahead. So I hope the best for everyone out there, and I want to make sure that, again, that message gets through. Otherwise, if you're elsewhere in the United States, consider yourself lucky where you're going to see some of that quieter weather, some of that more summer-like weather, and remember to take advantage of those fall colors while we have them. I'll be back here next Sunday. Make sure to follow along as we give you weekly updates and keep you ahead of the changing weather.